Since around about the turn of the century, society has gradually been becoming more and more focused on the mental health and well-being of people. We have dedicated entire months out of the year, to awareness for various different conditions and strive to start up conversations surrounding mental health issues for men, women and just people in general, especially those that are often unnoticeable and highly personal. These issues are often more common than people expect, and that's why it's important for people in these vulnerable states to realise that they aren't alone and always have a solution to their issues, no matter how serious they may seem. But how does this relate to cinema? Well, it's simple. In movies, or just fiction in general, people always care about the stories that contain the characters that they like and that they can relate to. And most people can relate to characters that go through similar struggles to themselves. And this is why the tragic hero is such a popular archetype. Characters like Batman and Spider-Man having these deep-rooted psychological traumas within them, yet still persistent in doing good, is inspiring for those who are always struggling from similar issues. This is why, especially in the last 20 years or so, we have seen more and more films about characters who struggle with mental illness and their struggles to fit in society, which may mirror a section of the audience that are watching the film and how their mental illness affects their daily struggles. These films have definitely become more prevalent in the last 2 decades as a society, because society has become far more accepting and understanding, when it comes to everything that surrounds mental health. So it's now more appropriate and also more profitable than ever to discuss mental health in cinema. So today we're going to be covering some good and bad examples of mental illness in movies and see how Hollywood can tackle this issue going forward for the betterment of themselves, the industry, and just people and the audience watching them. The beauty of Rain Man is it covers a mental health disorder that not enough people seem to focus on, especially when in the whole conversation of mental illness. Most people think that having a mental illness is some sort of serious emotional stress or erratic behaviour that's really noticeable and concerning to everyone. But so many people out there with mental illnesses manifest themselves as a sort of neurodivergence, just a different way of acting. It may just appear as an innate ability for certain cognitive tasks and a deficiency in others. Whilst autism does have a perceived positive effect, that in the case of Rain Man is his mathematical problem-solving abilities, it does also have its negative effects, like the effect of how you socialise with other people. In the film, Dustin Hoffman portrays an autistic savant called Raymond Babbitt, and his brother Charlie, who's played by Tom Cruise, in the beginning of the film is exploiting Raymond for his money, as his wealthy father left his money in his will to Raymond as opposed to Charlie, as Charlie is sort of a stuck-up, snobby brat. Raymond, having been in an institution for most of his life, as well as his severe autism, makes his social skills non-existent, and he struggles so much with normal everyday interactions and behaviours that we take for granted. And he struggles with them so much that he irritates everyone around him, and especially Charlie. However, the reason I think this is a good depiction of mental illness in movies is the way the connection builds between Charlie and Raymond as the film goes on. On the surface level, it appears that Charlie only begins to care for Raymond when it benefits him financially. However, their bond really manifests ultimately, and it's culminated in one beautifully crafted scene. We see Charlie running a hot bath for Raymond. Then, out of nowhere, Raymond starts to become very agitated, screaming about how the water will burn baby. This story ultimately leads to Charlie having a revelation about his childhood, where a long-lost memory that he forgot he had about a childhood imaginary friend called Rain Man, who would always protect him from harm. Rain Man was really Raymond, his long-lost brother that he never knew he had. This beautiful moment really encapsulates why this is one of the best examples of mental illness portrayals in Hollywood. Many times mental illness is either weaponized or vilified in some form in cinema. Yet this scene that we see a man realise the error of his ways when it comes to the treatment of another human being. The movie humanises the mental health issues. It focuses not just on the illness, but on the character with the illness. We see that Raymond isn't just a vessel for mental illness. He is a person with his own values, and that's encapsulated perfectly in this scene where, despite his difficulty talking to people, interacting with people and showing normal emotions, he deeply cares for Charlie. This development from Raymond leads to a huge shift in Charlie's character, which ultimately leads to a bond on screen that is both wholesome and believable. As he ends up taking Raymond back to the institution, against Raymond's will. Raymond doesn't want to go back, but Charlie knows it's what's best for his brother. And he ultimately forfeits the money that he would have had because he loves his brother and he wants him to have it. And that's a really beautiful, wholesome ending. And I think not only is that a beautiful story, it's a really accurate and beautiful depiction of an individual with mental illness. This movie ties in nicely with Rain Man, as this movie also depicts autism, or autism spectrum disorder. However, it is one of the worst depictions of mental health issues that I've ever seen in a movie. I actually first heard about this film from a Chris Stuckman video, so I thought I'd watch it for myself. Obviously, going into it, the video wasn't overly positive, so I was going into it with a slightly warped mindset, but I tried to keep fair and balanced. But this was just, it really didn't disappoint in how terrible it was. Now, there are many things wrong with this movie. There's directorial choices, writing, acting, basically all of it, casting. But I'm going to be just focusing on its portrayal of autism and how egregious it is. This is one of the most inaccurate and downright offensive portrayals of autism I've seen in any piece of media ever. It's just so one-note and stereotypical. For some reason, John Travolta and the writers choose to portray autism spectrum disorder and autism in a sort of Billy Madison, Forrest Gump level of incompetence, as opposed to the highly complex and varied neurodiversity that it really is. He talks and dresses like a child who's lost his money. He has this autistic-like obsession, that really never manifests itself in this way. Most of the time these obsessions or fixations that people with autism tend to revolve around a specific topic, like movies or animals, or something like that, but very rarely is it around specific people. And those with autism are very unlikely to become stalkers, and even less likely to become violent, like the character Moose does. Nothing about this portrayal of autism is accurate, from what I understand. To be honest, if I were a person on the autistic spectrum, I would be outraged and offended by this movie. He takes such a one-note approach to autism. Like the stereotypical speech and hysteria that many people often wrongly associate with autism. And there's no subtlety in this performance by Travolta either. Everything he does is done with the explicit and ham-fisted approach of informing the audience that Moose is in fact autistic. And there's no balance either. It's not like he's specifically good at something like people with autism always are. He's just a weirdo, and that's just how he's presented. He wears strange clothes, not because of a specific story or a specific person as illustrated by context, but rather just people with autism are weird, lol. He screams and gets shaky, not because of any specific trauma, but again, just because people with autism are weird, lol. Honestly, I could talk about how terrible this movie is for quite a while, but for the sake of the video and my sanity, I think we should move on. This, I think, is the movie that most people think about when it comes to the theme of mental health and mental illness in movies. I think this movie is very realistic and provides a very moral and ethical stance on how the mentally ill should be treated. The premise is a man, played by Jack Nicholson, feigns mental illness in order to be placed into a psychiatric hospital, which ends up being far more pleasant than the prison that he was ultimately in. And it also means that he gets out of all of his, work duties that he had at the prison. He then starts off being a bit of an arsehole to everyone around him, but over time he starts to form emotional connections with those mentally ill patients and becomes part of a sort of like a friend group / family. However, due to his lack of mental illness, he begins to notice that the staff are mistreating the patients, and he ends up helping them to realise by themselves that they're being mistreated. He doesn't spell it out for them, he just helps them to realise and encourages them on their own, and shows them they're being mistreated by the character of Nurse Ratched. This movie puts you in a position where you're observing those who are mentally ill, but frames them in a way where you see them so frequently in so many daily activities that they become more than just vessels for illness. They become characters within their own right. They have their own personality traits and things that they like. Although everyone in this film is unwell, they are all fundamentally kind and moral people. In fact, in this movie, those who are deemed to be mentally well are the ones who are committing the most immoral and abusive acts, that being the nurses and the orderlies. This movie, I think, perfectly reflects how those with a mental illness are often treated in society, albeit in an exaggerated way. Those with mental illnesses are treated as if they are lesser to others, and that they need to be instructed and punished instead of cared for and nurtured. Not only does the criminal ultimately make the mentally ill happier, but they also make him happier as well as a result. It's a beautiful story about seeing the good in people, and even when they are at their weakest and most vulnerable, despite all of this, everyone is deserving of love and appreciation, despite their differences and difficulties that they may have. This movie spreads a message of positivity even when you are in one of the worst positions you can be in. And most importantly, it shows us that the mentally ill is not just weak, they're not just weak victims, but strong, powerful people who are willing to work every day despite the limitations to be the best person they can be. I mean, most of them are in the hospital because they're trying to better themselves. And ultimately, Mac gets better because he chooses not to break out and leave the hospital. He chooses to stay with the people that he thinks need him. This movie covers so many different illnesses, but despite the illness that they have, it shows that everyone is worthy of respect and love, and that people who should come together, both in times of prosperity and tragedy. I think this movie covers every aspect of mental illness and its treatment and their treatment in society perfectly. The new release of the sequel, I thought it would be important to make this video in the hopes the sequel doesn't have the same glaring issues and perpetuate the same false narratives that the first film did. Now, there have been many criticisms of Joker, about how it copies Taxi Driver, or how it copies Fight Club, or how it copies King of Comedy, but we're not going to talk about that. I think we just need to talk about the focus on mental illness, and I think it gets mental illness just entirely wrong. I think one big issue with Joker is trying to cover so many topics that it ultimately gets confused and just falls flat for me. It is supposed to be a story that represents how mental illness can affect a person, but all it ultimately does is just end up justifying horrible acts of violence because the person committing the acts has some vague, unexplained mental health disorder. The story takes place in 1980s New York, which is portrayed as overcrowded, dirty, and full of rude, unpleasant people. And Gotham's supposed to be based on New York, which, I don't know, seems to fit the bill perfectly. Then we meet Arthur Fleck, and get this, he's mentally ill. He also has mental health issues, and is maybe even slightly unwell in the brain. Yeah, that's it. That's his whole character. Basically, no one likes him because he's mentally ill, which is both a horrible and completely untrue narrative about how mentally ill people should be treated. This lack of compassion and companionship in his life lead him down a path of murder, apparently. Essentially, the whole story is about a man committing horrible crimes and being seen as an icon and a champion of the people because he did awful things. If anyone else did what he did, they'd be seen as the villain, like the character is literally supposed to be. But because he's mentally ill and lower class, it's apparently just perfectly acceptable behaviour. I think perpetuating the narrative that mental illness makes people violent and antisocial is completely unfair. And I know that technically the story tries to be that it was the society that made him like this, but there are millions of other people in that city that were experiencing what he experienced, and none of them murdered people. So again, it doesn't really work. At least in other stories, those with mental illnesses still attempt to integrate themselves in society. But Arthur never even tries to fit in. He never once do we actually see Arthur's personality. He's just a walking mental illness. He never tries to be friends or interact with anyone, really. And it's such a vague and low effort form of mental illness too. He sees things that aren't there. He's always sad. He gets nervous doing literally anything. He has no social skills and laughs unconsciously. Like, what illnesses doesn't he have at this point? They've just got a dartboard and they're just throwing them at him. It's like, yeah, he's got that and that and that. But then all of a sudden he puts on his clown makeup and he has none of the symptoms anymore. He's suddenly really confident and not scared of anything and happy all the time. I guess a couple of counts of first-degree murder really helps to just clear one's mind. I guess this movie was more about social commentary, about how fractured and tense our modern social and political climate has become. And in order to illustrate this, they create this non-existent character, give him all the vague behaviour tropes associated with mental illness, and use him as a blunt instrument to force the themes of societal tension down the audience's throat for over 2 hours. I think this audience wants me to feel sorry for Arthur Fleck in some way, but he has such a non-existent character outside of his vague mental illness, and has done so many irredeemable things, or comparatively such minor reasons, that it makes me just want him and his message that he's trying to spread to just fail. And I hope Lady Gaga dies in the second movie as well. Fuck Lady Gaga. So I think from these examples, we have identified a pattern around the treatment and portrayal of mental illness in movies. The two good examples of mental illness in cinema show that those with mental illness should be treated with care and respect. And they both take different routes to get there and tell vastly different stories to each other, but ultimately they end up making the same final point. Mental illness is not what defines a person, but rather the character of their soul. Bad movies, however, are harsh and illustrate mental illness as being inherently violent and wrong, or being a means of justifying violence. Both individuals with mental illness in these two movies aren't really characters, they're just sort of one-dimensional vessels for their illness, and have no real interesting personality traits outside of it. Both these characters, the writers just came up with mental illness for the character and then just stopped writing anything else, it seems like. The narrative has been perpetuated by cinema for years that mental illness is the only thing that defines a person, or that it is okay to be weaponized. And it's so universal now that we, the audience, don't really think about that anymore. But cinema is supposed to represent everyone. So always villainizing or misunderstanding a very large subset of the cinema audience is a thing that needs to be left in the past. Movies of tomorrow should aim to celebrate and correctly represent those with mental illnesses, in order to make those who suffer from similar afflictions feel seen and understood. Not only would this be a good precedent for society going forward, but it would also be beneficial for those making the films, as they now have a larger audience to respect their work. But hey, what the fuck do I know? Goodbye.